İşte yine başlıyoruz. Çok yorgun hissediyorum.
I was sitting on the concrete floor of a hostel in Tijuana, staring at my phone screen. Insufficient funds. The words appeared when I tried to buy a bus ticket to the border. My last 20 pesos had gone to a stale sandwich 12 hours ago. I was a 64-year-old man who'd run out of options in a foreign country. 24 months earlier, I'd stepped off a plane in Puerto Vallarta with $180,000 and a plan to spend my retirement years in paradise. Now, I was counting coins, hoping someone would help me get home. But let me go back to where this all started, because everything made perfect sense at the time. I was 62 when my marriage fell apart. 31 years with Susan ended quietly with the realization that we'd become strangers. The divorce was civil. After legal fees, I walked away with a $180,000. At 62, with no pension, that money had to last. 28 years as an accountant teaches you to plan ahead. Living in Colorado on $180,000 meant working until 70. But I kept reading about Americans retiring abroad, stretching their dollars where living costs were a fraction of home prices. Mexico kept coming up in the research. Americans could get residency, the healthcare was decent, the climate was warm year-round, and the cost of living, at least according to the expat blogs I read obsessively, would let me live well on what I'd saved. Puerto Vallarta seemed perfect, close enough to fly back if needed, far enough that everything would be new. I spent months researching. The math worked. I could live comfortably for 20 years without touching principal. The flight from Denver in March 2022 was my first time leaving the United States since my honeymoon. I remember feeling hope as we descended. I'd rented a small apartment in the Zona Romantica, 1 bedroom, furnished, 6 blocks from the beach. The rent was $420 a month, exactly budgeted. The first weeks were everything I'd hoped for. Morning coffee at a cafe where the owner spoke English. Afternoon walks. Evening meals at different restaurants. The expat community was friendly without the baggage of my old life. It was at a grocery store that I met Maria. Mid-20s, easy smile, perfect English. When she helped me find rice vinegar, we started talking. She was studying business administration, working part-time while supporting her family. Over the following weeks, our conversations became regular. Maria would practice English with me, and I'd ask about Mexican culture. She was intelligent and honest about challenges young people faced. Education is expensive, she explained one afternoon. My family owns a small farm, but crop prices are unpredictable. My father says education is the only way to build something stable, but university costs more than our farm makes in 6 months. After months of living alone, talking to someone who seemed genuinely interested in my stories felt good. Maria would ask about my life in Colorado, about what it was like to be an accountant. Americans work so much, she said one day, shaking her head. In Mexico, family comes first. Work is just work. But you Americans, you work until you're old. Then you move to places like this to finally enjoy life. Why not enjoy life from the beginning? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the divorce. 3 months later, Maria mentioned struggling to pay for her final semester. The tuition was 15,000 pesos, about $850. She wasn't asking for help, just explaining why she'd been working extra hours. What happens if you can't pay? I asked. I wait another year, save the money. $850 was nothing to me, but everything to her. I offered to help that same day. She initially refused, but I convinced her this was one friend helping another. I transferred the money that afternoon. She cried when the payment went through. Maria graduated 4 months later with honors. I attended the ceremony, met her family from Guadalajara. Her parents thanked me repeatedly for helping their daughter finish school. After graduation, Maria got a job at a local hotel, We continued spending time together, but the dynamic had changed. She was now a professional with her own income. Maria suggested we become more than friends. "You helped me change my life," she said one evening. "You understand responsibility." I was cautious about the age difference. I was 63, she was 26. But she seemed sure. The relationship developed slowly. Maria introduced me to her family and friends. Everyone was welcoming. I wasn't some old American taking advantage. 6 months later, Maria brought up buying property together. "Rent is throwing money away," she said, showing me listings. "If we buy together, we're building equity. The real estate market here is strong." A 2-bedroom condo was selling for $85,000. We could put down $25,000 and finance the rest. Monthly payments would match my current rent. Mexican law restricted foreign ownership near coastlines, but Maria, as a Mexican citizen, could hold title while I provided financing. "We're planning to get married anyway," she said. "You can't lose money on Puerto Vallarta real estate." I wanted to believe her, and honestly, the logic seemed sound. We were serious about each other. Marriage was a natural next step, and the financial benefits were clear. Instead of paying rent with no equity, we'd be building wealth together. I transferred $25,000 from my savings account to Maria's account for the down payment. We found a beautiful condo in a new development 5 minutes from the beach. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, modern finishes, and a community pool. The monthly payments were manageable, split between us based on our respective incomes. For several months, everything was perfect. We were living together in our own place, building something as a couple. Maria's family accepted me completely. Her mother would cook special meals when we visited. Her father and I would sit on the porch, him practicing his English while I worked on my Spanish. It felt like I'd found not just a partner, but a whole new family. But then Maria's expenses began to increase. It started small. Her mother needed medication for diabetes that wasn't covered by the public health system. Could I help with 2,000 pesos? Of course I could. Family takes care of family. Her younger brother was starting university and needed money for books and supplies. Another 3,000 pesos. Her father's truck broke down and he needed it for work. The repair costs were 8,000 pesos, more than the family could manage. Each request made sense individually. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities. Medical care, education, work equipment. I had the money. Maria's family had welcomed me with open arms. Helping them felt like the right thing to do. But the requests became more frequent, and the amounts got larger. Maria's cousin was getting married and needed help with wedding expenses. Her aunt lost her job and needed support while she looked for work. Her grandfather required surgery that would cost 15,000 pesos out of pocket. Always something urgent, always a family emergency that required immediate financial help. Within a year, I calculated that I'd given Maria's family approximately $8,000. She always promised to pay me back when things improved, but something new would come up before she could repay the previous loan. I began to feel like the family's personal bank, but I didn't know how to address the situation without seeming selfish or culturally insensitive. The breaking point came when Maria presented me with a business opportunity that she said would solve all our financial concerns. Her cousin owned a small restaurant in downtown Puerto Vallarta that was struggling. Tourist traffic was down after the pandemic, and he was having trouble keeping up with rent and supplier payments. But Maria had analyzed the business and believed it could be profitable with better management and some investment in renovations. "He's willing to sell us 50% of the business for $35,000, she explained, showing me financial statements and renovation plans. "With your business background and my local knowledge, we can turn this place around." Restaurants in the tourist zone make good money when they're run properly. The numbers looked reasonable, at least on paper. The location was decent, foot traffic was steady, and the previous owner's problems seemed to be related to poor management rather than fundamental business flaws. Maria's plan for improvements was thorough and realistic, but $35,000 was a significant portion of my remaining savings. I'd already spent $25,000 on the condo down payment and approximately $8,000 on family emergencies. My nest egg was shrinking faster than I'd planned. I need to think about this, I told her. It's a lot of money. Of course, she said, but don't think too long. My cousin needs to make a decision soon. If we don't take this opportunity, he'll have to sell to someone else. The pressure to decide quickly made me uncomfortable, but I also understood the reality of business opportunities. Good deals don't wait for perfect timing. After 2 weeks of consideration, I agreed to the investment. I transferred $35,000 to Maria for the restaurant purchase. She handled all the paperwork, since the business would be registered under Mexican ownership. I trusted her completely, and she kept me informed about every step of the process. For the first few months, the restaurant seemed to be doing well. Maria would show me daily receipts, discuss customer feedback, share ideas for expanding the menu. We were spending long days at the restaurant, working together to implement improvements. I felt useful and productive in a way I hadn't since retirement. But after 6 months, I started noticing inconsistencies. The daily receipts Maria showed me didn't always align with what I observed during my visits. When I asked about specific transactions, she had explanations, but they seemed rehearsed. One afternoon, I watched maybe a dozen customers over 3 hours, but the receipt showed we'd served 40 people that day. Business varies, she explained when I brought up the discrepancy. Afternoon is always slow. Most of our customers come for breakfast and dinner. I wanted to believe her, but doubt was creeping in. When I suggested we meet with an accountant to ensure our books were accurate and tax compliant, Maria became defensive. "You don't trust me?" she asked, looking hurt. "After everything we've built together, you think I'm lying about the business?" The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. I was starting to have doubts, but I didn't want to admit it to myself or to her. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe the stress of living in a foreign country and managing a business was making me suspicious of normal fluctuations in revenue. I dropped the subject, but the uncertainty remained. The situation exploded when I discovered that the restaurant wasn't actually ours. I'd gone to the municipal office to ask about business licensing requirements, thinking we should make sure all our permits were current. When I mentioned the restaurant name and address, the clerk looked confused. "That business is registered to Carlos Mendoza," she said, showing me the official documentation. "There's no record of any ownership change or partnership agreement." Carlos Mendoza was Maria's cousin, the man who'd supposedly sold us 50% of his restaurant. But according to the municipal records, he was still the sole owner. My $35,000 investment had bought me nothing. When I confronted Maria that evening, she broke down completely. "The business was failing worse than I told you," she sobbed. "Carlos needed the money to pay debts, not to sell partnership shares. I thought we could make the restaurant profitable and then formalize everything later. I was trying to protect you from the legal complications." "So where's my money?" I asked. "It went to pay suppliers, rent, employee salaries. It kept the business running. Without that money, Carlos would have lost everything, and we would have had nothing to save." The explanation didn't make sense. If the business was failing that badly, why had she encouraged me to invest? And why hadn't she been honest about the risks? That night, I sat down with my bank statements and calculated exactly how much money I'd given to Maria and her family over the past 2 years. The condo down payment, family emergencies, restaurant investment, and various smaller expenses added up to $76,000. Nearly half of my retirement savings. I was 64 years old, living in a foreign country, with $104,000 left in my bank account. The money was disappearing faster than I'd planned, and I had nothing to show for most of it. When I tried to discuss the situation with Maria, she became increasingly defensive and then angry. "You think I'm stealing from you," she said. "You think I'm just some poor Mexican girl trying to take advantage of a rich American." "That's not what I think," I replied. "But I need to understand where my money went and why the restaurant investment didn't work out the way you described." "You want to understand?" she shouted. "Then maybe you should go back to Colorado, where everything is simple and everyone speaks your language and thinks the way you think." The relationship deteriorated rapidly after that conversation. Maria began staying out late, claiming she was working extra hours at the hotel to help with family expenses. When she was home, we barely spoke. The condo that had felt like our shared space now felt like a battlefield where we avoided each other. 3 weeks later, Maria sat me down for a conversation I should have seen coming. "This isn't working anymore," she said, her voice calm but final. "We want different things. You want someone who makes you feel comfortable and never challenges you. I want someone who understands my culture and doesn't question every peso I spend on my family." "What about the condo?" I asked. "What about the money I invested in the restaurant?" "The condo is in my name," she said simply. "Legally, it's mine. The restaurant money is gone. Carlos used it to pay debts. There's nothing left to recover." She moved out the next day, taking her belongings and leaving me alone in the condo that I'd paid for but didn't own. I contacted a lawyer to understand my legal options. The consultation cost $200 and lasted 30 minutes. The attorney explained that Mexican property law was clear. Maria was the legal owner of the condo. As her boyfriend, I had no claim to the property. The money I'd given her family could be considered gifts, which weren't recoverable. The restaurant investment would be nearly impossible to recover without documentation proving partnership agreements that apparently didn't exist. "Did you keep records of all the money transfers?" he asked. "Yes, I have bank statements showing every transaction." "But do you have contracts? Signed agreements? Documentation showing these were loans rather than gifts?" I didn't. Everything had been based on trust, on the assumption that we were building a life together. "I'm sorry," the lawyer said, and he seemed to mean it. "Without legal documentation, you have very little recourse. This is why we always recommend that foreign nationals use proper legal structures for property investment and business partnerships." That night, I sat in the condo and did the math. I'd lost $76,000. But more than that, I was paying rent on a place I didn't own. My monthly expenses in Puerto Vallarta were now higher than they would have been in Colorado, and I had no partner to share costs. The retirement plan that had seemed so financially sound was falling apart. I could stay and try to rebuild, but my remaining money wouldn't last more than 3 years if I maintained my current lifestyle. Or I could go back to the United States, find work, and try to stretch what was left while earning additional income. The decision felt impossible. At 64, starting over in the United States meant admitting failure to everyone who'd watched me move to Mexico with such confidence. But staying meant slowly burning through my remaining savings until I was truly stuck. I decided to stay, at least for a while, and try to make the money last longer. I moved out of the expensive condo into a much smaller apartment in a less desirable neighborhood. The rent was $180 a month, but the area was rough. Street noise all night, unreliable utilities, neighbors who played music at volumes that made sleep difficult. But it was what I could afford. I stopped eating out, started cooking all my meals at home, and then stopped taking taxis, learned to navigate the public bus system, and cut every expense I could identify. The comfortable retirement lifestyle I'd enjoyed for 2 years disappeared, replaced by a daily focus on stretching every peso as far as possible. The isolation was crushing. The expat community I'd been part of existed in restaurants and bars that I could no longer afford. My Spanish wasn't good enough for deep friendships with Mexican neighbors. I spent most days alone, reading books I'd downloaded to my phone, taking long walks because they were free. After 6 months of this lifestyle, I'd managed to slow the bleeding, but I hadn't stopped it. My savings were still decreasing every month, and I was miserable. The final blow came when I got sick. It started as a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. After 2 weeks, I went to a clinic and was diagnosed with pneumonia. The treatment required antibiotics, rest, and follow-up care. Even with Mexico's affordable health care, the medical expenses drained what little buffer I had left. Lying in that cheap apartment, sick and alone, I realized I was out of options. My savings account had $8,400 left. In Colorado, that might cover 2 months of expenses if I was careful. In Puerto Vallarta, it might last 3 months. Either way, it wasn't enough to sustain any kind of life. I needed to go home, but I didn't have enough money for a plane ticket and the security deposit on an apartment and food while I looked for work. That's when I started making the phone calls I'd been dreading. I called my ex-wife first. We'd ended our marriage amicably, but we hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized. I explained the situation as briefly as possible and asked if she could loan me money for a plane ticket home. "I'm sorry," Susan said, and she sounded like she meant it. "But my finances are tight too. The divorce settlement, the legal fees, starting over at my age. I just don't have extra money to loan." I called my brother in Denver. We'd never been close, but we were family. He listened to my story without interrupting, then sighed heavily. "I can probably help with a few $100s," he said, "but I can't support you while you get back on your feet. I've got my own family to worry about." I called former colleagues, distant relatives, anyone who might be willing to help. The conversations were humiliating, explaining how I'd gone from comfortable retirement to near poverty in less than 3 years. Most people were sympathetic, but unable to help with the amounts I needed. After a week of phone calls, I'd managed to collect promises for about $1,200, enough for a plane ticket, but not enough for much else. I used some of my remaining cash to buy a bus ticket to Tijuana, figuring it would be cheaper to fly out of there than from Puerto Vallarta. The bus ride took 14 hours through countryside that looked nothing like the paradise I'd imagined when I first arrived in Mexico. The hostel in Tijuana cost $12 a night, but it was the cheapest accommodation I could find. My roommates were backpackers in their 20s, traveling through Mexico on gap year adventures. They were friendly enough, but I felt like an alien among them. A 64-year-old man with a broken suitcase, counting coins to buy food, sharing a dorm room with people who could have been my grandchildren. The plane ticket home cost $340. With the money my family and former colleagues had promised to wire, I could just afford it. But when I tried to buy the ticket online, my card was declined. I checked my account balance. $127. I'd miscalculated somewhere. Maybe it was the bus ticket to Tijuana, or the hostel fees, or the food I'd purchased without thinking carefully, but I was $213 short of the cheapest plane ticket I could find. That's when I found myself sitting on the hostel floor, staring at my phone screen, trying to figure out how to ask strangers for help. The other travelers in the hostel were kind. When they learned about my situation, several offered small amounts, $20 here, $30 there, not because they had money to spare, but because they understood what it felt like to be stranded in a foreign country. Within 2 days, I had enough for the plane ticket. The flight from Tijuana to Denver was the longest 3 hours of my life. I kept thinking about how confident I'd been when I made this journey in reverse 3 years earlier. How certain I'd been that I was making the right decision, that I'd figured out something other people hadn't. My brother met me at the airport. We didn't talk much during the drive to his house. What was there to say? I was 64 years old with a suitcase and $47 in my bank account, staying in his spare room because I had nowhere else to go. That was 8 months ago. I'm working now, part-time at a tax preparation office during busy season, helping people organize financial records I wish I'd kept for myself. The pay is modest, but it's honest work. I'm renting a studio apartment that costs more per month than I used to spend in a week in Puerto Vallarta. I've been trying to rebuild what I lost, but the math is stark. At my age, working part-time, it would take me 15 years to save $76,000 again. I don't have 15 years. I probably don't have 5. The hardest part isn't the money. It's the shame of explaining what happened to people who knew me before. Friends ask about my retirement in Mexico, expecting stories about beaches and adventure. Instead, I have to admit that I lost most of my life savings to poor decisions and misplaced trust. People try to be supportive. They tell me everyone makes mistakes, that I couldn't have known what would happen, that I shouldn't blame myself. But they're wrong about that last part. I should blame myself. I ignored warning signs because I wanted to believe I'd found something special. I made financial decisions based on emotions instead of logic. I trusted someone with my future without protecting myself legally. Mexico isn't the problem. I know Americans who've retired there successfully, who've built good lives and managed their finances responsibly. The problem was me. My loneliness made me vulnerable to manipulation. My pride made me ignore red flags. My inexperience with relationships after 31 years of marriage made me confuse attention with genuine affection. I don't know what the future holds. At 64, I'm too young for full Social Security benefits, but too old for most employers to take seriously. I'm starting over with less money than I had when I was 25, and without the decades of earning potential that made starting over possible back then. Some nights I lie awake doing different versions of the math, trying to figure out scenarios where I could still have a decent retirement. But the numbers never work out well. I'll be working until I can't anymore, living paycheck to paycheck, hoping my health holds out long enough to avoid becoming a burden on the few family members who are still speaking to me. The worst part is knowing how easily this could have been prevented. If I'd kept my property in the United States instead of trying to buy in Mexico, if I'd maintained my savings as an emergency fund instead of treating them as investment capital, if I'd been honest about the red flags instead of explaining them away. But I didn't do any of those things. I was a lonely man who thought he'd found love and partnership in a foreign country. Instead, I found out how quickly a retirement plan can become a disaster when you stop thinking clearly about money and start making decisions with your heart. I'm not telling this story for sympathy. I'm telling it because I wish someone had told me a story like this before I bought that plane ticket to Puerto Vallarta. Maybe I would have listened. Maybe I would have been more careful. Maybe I would have kept enough money in reserve to ensure I always had a way home. If you're thinking about retiring abroad with your savings, please be more careful than I was. Don't put property in someone else's name, no matter how much you trust them. Don't loan money to family members you've known for months instead of years. Don't invest in businesses without proper legal documentation. Keep enough money in your home country to come back if everything goes wrong. Because everything can go wrong. And when it does, being 64 years old and stranded in a foreign country with no money is not an adventure. It's a nightmare that you might not wake up from.